So then the NIF model, actually let me get it to you here. Yeah, so the NIF model is kind of set up to, what do I do again? This way. So this is kind of one of the basic tools. This is 2-hour meeting in a sense. Again, frame very, here's a common problem we all agree with. Here's at least 3 different approaches. The actual process itself is you'll spend time after you introduce the model and you kind of let people talk about why they're there and kind of their values. Then you walk through each of the approaches systematically, right? So this is what we'll do here in a second. We're running out of time a little bit, so we'll do it a little shorter, but you'll get a sense of it. But normally you spend about 20 minutes on each approach, really thinking through that. With a facilitator, the facilitator is trying to make sure you think about both sides. What do you like about this approach? What do you not like about it? What do you kind of struggle with this approach? So once you've walked through the 3, then you have another 30 minutes or an hour at the end. Now that we've had this conversation, where we move forward. And the design of the approaches aren't, at the end you don't vote. You don't say, how many of y'all for approach 1? Raise your hand, because you're not trying to pick which one to do. The design of the approach is to ensure a full conversation, to make sure you see lots of different sides of it, right? Typically going in, you might really like an approach, but the design of the process will help you realize that, you know what, that there's some flaws here, right? And you might really not like another approach, but the way it's framed, an outside impartial body is framing the approaches. They're framing kind of as fairly as possible. You're framing for deliberation, framing for people to have a tough conversation. Most of our framing in society is framing for persuasion, right? I'm framing it to get people to think like I want them to think, right? We're framing things because we want them to have a tough conversation, right? So in the back end, the kind of reflections time at the end, after the deliberation is walking through the approaches. Typically it's 3, it's at least 3, sometimes it's 4 or 5, right? Part of the reason for 3 is you're getting away from the pro-con, right? The way it's framed, it should be that you don't have one approach that's the opposite of another approach, right? Each approach, you're kind of looking at doing the approach and not doing the approach within that approach, right? So each approach should be somewhat distinct. So you'll see a couple different examples. I think we copied in your guide of the pages from my workbook. I think you have some examples. Yeah, here, my little cheat sheet. If you look on page 48, 48 and 49, you have some additional examples. A lot of times these workbooks, NIF creates these workbooks. Public Agenda also does. So there's a lot of workbooks out there. So in terms of class, you can find pre-made material on tons of different issues that you can just use in your class for conversation. What I do in that deliberation class is they have to create one of these, right? So they're assignment for the semester. And the reason why I think the class works so much better now when we pull it off, it's a hard class to pull off. At the end of the semester, instead of them saying, oh, no, no, right, because of the 2 debates, right? At the end of the semester, they feel they know something, right? Because we didn't ask them to solve the issue, right? We didn't ask them to come up with the best solution to this tough problem, right? We asked them to make sense of the issue and to lay out the options, right? So, and I think this is really the role of the expert in society. The expert can't tell us, you need to do X. The expert can tell us, hey, you can do X, Y, and Z, and here's what happens if you have X, Y, and Z, and here's the trade-offs of it, right? But the decision is the public's decision, right? Because again, there's not a right answer, right? There's better and worse answers depending on what's important to you, right? So now at the end of the semester, the students feel like experts, right? I know about this issue. They might prefer a certain option, right? But again, the role of the expert is not to make the decision. The role of the expert is that these are the choices you have to make, right? And these choices and this information based on good information and research that helps us really understand, right? So that's what these discussion guides. When you look at deliberation broadly, there are several aspects to deliberative practice that helps us have a better conversation. So part of it is good background material, right? That's created by an impartial source that provides a base of information. There's a lot of statistics and things in here, right? And then you have the small groups, so you can actually have interaction. You have a facilitator that can kind of help you have that conversation. We'll get a lot into that this afternoon. You have, at the beginning of the meeting, you talk about the ground rules and goals, right? So at the beginning of my meetings, I talk a little bit about deliberation. I often show the grown zone graphic to the public. I talk about what we're doing and talk about the need to work through. I talk a little bit about tensions and give a little mini lecture, not a 2-hour one like this morning, but a little 8-minute lecture on kind of wicked problems and how we have to change the way we talk. So we kind of setting an environment. And then the ground rules, I'll show you ground rules later, but talk about how to listen to understand and to kind of respect other perspectives, but also to be honest, right? So we're negotiating that. We're negotiating civility. Right? I tend not to use the word civility. It's a very popular word now. Some people don't like civility because civility is used to quiet voices a lot of times, right? Sometimes we need to be angry, right? So there's that negotiation. We want people to be respectful of other opinions, but we also want people to be truthful, right? And we don't want people to hold back in a sense because they think that what they're saying might not be inappropriate. Right? So we try to set these ground rules to kind of do that. We have one ground rule that we really like. It's okay to disagree, but disagree with curiosity and hostility, right? We want people we invite them to disagree. We don't want, if someone else is saying something they disagree with, we want them to say, I think differently than that, right? We want to open up that space, but we also don't want them to attack that person, right? And that's one of the interesting design aspects. By having good background material, which is typically built through public process, right? Like the superintendent example, we had 2,000 surveys. From those 2,000 surveys, we developed background materials that we're reacting to, right? So now, instead of me having to disagree with Ashley to her face, I can disagree with this, right? It allows me, because we don't know how to disagree, right? Some people love disagreeing, right? Some people love conflict, and most people avoid conflict. Very few people are in the middle, which kind of try to make conflict productive, right? So by having background material to react to, it makes it easier for people to have a tough conversation without having to disagree with people at the table. They can disagree with this, right? And it gives you a mechanism to do that. And then obviously the facilitator is making it easier for people to disagree in a productive way by how they ask questions and those type of things. And you'll see, we'll talk about those kind of questions in a little bit, right? So that's the kind of basic NIF model. I would probably say a third, maybe a half of our processes kind of use this model in some sense of having different approaches, right? Lots of other models, and again, the NCD resource guide shows, wisdom cafes and citizens juries, and all these different kind of ways of kind of doing this work. But we'll focus today on the NIF model. It's a nice base model, and it's a really good model for classrooms. Political science classrooms, communication classrooms. We go into economics classes and do forums like this. We go into sociology classes. There's books on race issues. There's books on immigration issues. There's so many different topics in there that we serve. One of the other kind of roles that we serve, I don't know how much Wendy does this, is we're kind of the deliberation center on campus, right? Just like there's probably a speaking center, right? That we can kind of help you train students how to give a good speech, or a writing center, help you kind of train your students how to write. That maybe your discipline isn't writing, but you need some help. So the deliberation centers on campus can be, hey, if you want to have an interactive conversation in your class, but you don't know how to do that, right? Sometimes I bring my students to other classes and we split them up and have these conversations. Often using these preset books that already exist online. You've got a couple, again, Public Agenda and NIF have tons of them. Most of them are free online, or maybe $1 or $2 to get the PDF. Or you can kind of produce your own. So we're going to be doing, in a second here, we're going to jump in and kind of use the Shaping Our Future as an example to kind of, you'll be the participants, I'll be the facilitator, to kind of show you a little bit how one works. And then this afternoon, we'll do another one with just a one-page framing, right? And we normally do the one-page framing. Most of these NIF books, these are short, these are the new ones, this one's 12 pages. They used to be about 30 pages, again, the 3 approaches, but the last 2 pages would be a summary, just like this one, and the last 2 pages are a summary. We knew people showing up, like for class, we can give them the 30-page one and assign it, they're supposed to read it and come to class. But for the public, we can't, right? Even if we have a 30-page one, who reads it? Yeah. So most of the time, we would just use these 2 pages at the end. We would call it a placemat. We would photocopy it, one big piece of paper, like 11 by 17, and they would have it in front of them like a placemat, right? So that's kind of what we'll be doing here is mainly, hopefully you got to read the whole thing, but even if you didn't, just have those last 2 pages in front of you. We'll walk through that, and that becomes just something to react to for the facilitator to kind of use, right? So some of our events, all we've done is develop a one-page summary. Here's one thing just to react, to help kind of structure the conversation, to help us have a little deeper conversation.
Martine, do you think we have time to watch the video, or should we get straight to the...
So lunch is getting here at 12:15, right?
Yeah, well, we have it scheduled to eat at 12:30. They said they're going to be here at 12.
Okay.
We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, we can split it. We can do part of it and then have lunch and then do the other part. So I got time afterwards. We had to read the forum. We got quite a bit of time after lunch, so we don't have to finish the forum before lunch. So we can show the video. Because the other thing NIF does is they normally develop little 10-minute videos to introduce the topics. So again, in your classes, and the videos are nice because to introduce a topic, you have to be careful. You want to frame it, fairly to the different sides and things like that. So kind of doing that yourself can be tough. So that allows you a video to kind of frame it in a way that hopefully kind of lays it out. So we'll kind of do that example here in a second. Make sure I cover what you. So yeah, the NIF model, Typically 2 or 3 hour meetings, it's a medium-sized group. What we normally do is, we'll do this, but we'll have 15 tables doing it at the same time, right? And I'll talk a little about note taking before we go too. Works best when multiple similar meetings are held, because you really see how different kind of people react to it. Issues or focus are a common problem in at least 3 approaches. I talked about that. Discussion of the approaches is focused on having participants explore appreciations and concerns with dedicated. So all deliberative practices, you're making choices to structure the conversation in a certain way. We recognize, though, going back to passion and partiality, by us structuring the conversation in a certain way, that's a lot of power, right? There's always been a constant negotiation between letting the people talk about what they want to talk about and us kind of, no, we're going to structure, you're going to react to this data in a sense, right? So one of the boxes that at least the NIF model in particular uses is, we're going to focus on what you like and don't like about these 3 approaches, right? Especially during the heart of the deliberation. Now, when you get to reflections time, you're cutting across the approaches, you're adding new approaches, you're opening it up, right? But again, it's the notion of we don't have enough time to just talk about everything, right? So it is a structured conversation, but we recognize that we're using a lot of power when we structure the conversation that much, right? But you'll see when we do this, especially for the note, if we're doing this for real, we're taking notes. And I think Wendy's going to take notes to kind of show you an example of the type of notes you take with an NIF form way. But I'm going to force the conversation into, why do you like this approach and why don't you like the approach, right? And partly the reason is because that's the data that's most useful. If I have 15 conversations going at the same time, having a list of notes that's primarily organized into, these are the reasons they like it, and these are the reasons they don't like it, right? And then you'll have some other stuff or questions that might come up or other concern, So the shorthand that I use, and Wendy will kind of showing is, a comment that someone makes in support of it will be a plus, comment against it is a minus, and then just a bullet point for just a general comment, right? But you imagine I have 15 conversations for 2 hours. At the end of that, all those students type up their notes and send them to me, and then I have this whole long list. It's what's important to people. We did this for this grade configuration issue with the school district. We had them all written down. We're using easels, right? So we're taking all the notes on easels so people can kind of see the public notes. Right? At the end, we gave everyone 5 dots, and we said, put the dots next to the arguments that are kind of most resonating with you. Right? So they got up and read through everything and put the dots. So then now we had kind of some quantitative data of the reasons people liked or didn't like each approach, and the weight of those reasons, how strong they were. So when we give our report to the school district, telling the school district, the people that showed up to our meetings who weren't representative, right, who showed up were people who are passionate about the issue, which approach they liked of keeping it the same or changing it in a couple different ways with this issue wasn't as relevant as why they were for or against the change, right? So what the NIF model did was, instead of looking at the policy or what they wanted, it was why did they want it, right? And that was huge for helping them make the decision, because the school district could see what do people care about and why, right? But also they could, sometimes people cared about things that were wrong, right? They could look at it, okay, they were against this, but the reason they were against it is a reason that's not true, right? Or the evidence doesn't support it, so they can kind of not take that as seriously, right? But even more importantly, it was huge for the implementation of the decision. Once the district decided to change, to do option B essentially, right? They could look at everything that people liked about option A and say, how can we try to do some of that, right? And they could look at all the concerns about option B, right? And say, how do we mitigate that, right? But that's because the public process that we did forced people into the arguments they were for and against stuff versus just asking them what they were for and against. That make sense? So that helps us really kind of dig deep. So that's why I'll force y'all into that box sometimes. My follow-up question is like, so from that comment, does that mean you support this, or is that a concern that you have, right? And you'll see it bounce back and forth. And as a facilitator, say if we have 20 minutes per approach, in my head, I want to spend, not 10 minutes on each in a sense, but some nice time on what you like and what you don't like about the approach. So if everyone at the table seems to love it, then I'm going to push people to say, what's wrong about this, right? People that don't like this approach, what's important to them, right? If everyone's dumping on it, then I'm going to push, okay, we all don't seem to like it, but does anyone say anything good to say? I'll try to push. And you can't really say, we're going to spend 10 minutes on the good stuff and 10 minutes on the bad stuff, because someone's argument about good might spark someone's argument against that, right? So it's going to be kind of flexible, because it's interaction,